In 1978, a single machine sat in the corner of the American living room that cost more than a month of the average family's income. It weighed 78 pounds. It had a face of brushed aluminum, a row of meters that glowed amber in the dark, and enough power to fill a house until the neighbors a quarter mile away could hear it. It was called the Pioneer SX 1980, and it sold for $1,295. That is close to $5,000 in today's money. The median American household that year earned about $15,000. Do the math. Your grandfather's stereo cost him a month's salary, and he paid it gladly because the thing he carried home was his. Not a subscription, not a license. A machine he owned that would still be humming in the corner long after he was gone. Today, that machine is gone from almost every home in America. It didn't break. It wasn't banned. It was replaced quietly by something that costs you more forever and lets you own nothing at all. This is the story of how the most beautiful machine in the American living room disappeared, who replaced it, and why the names that were once the Rolls-Royce of sound now sit on cheap plastic soundbars sold online. Here's what nobody tells you about the way we listen now. In 2024, streaming made up 84% of every dollar the American music industry earned. More than 100 million Americans pay a subscription every single month, $11.99 on Spotify alone. And the day you stop paying, every song you ever collected disappears. You don't own a single note of it. Your grandfather's generation would have found that insane. To them, music was a thing you bought once and kept. The record, the machine, the sound coming out of it, all of it, yours. The stereo wasn't an appliance you hid in a cabinet. It was furniture. It was an investment. In a lot of homes, it was the second most expensive thing in the house after the car. To understand what we traded away, you have to go back to that living room, before the phone, before the earbuds, before the whole thing shrank into your pocket and started belonging to someone else. Walk into an American living room in 1975 and you would find it. The stack, a tower of separate machines, each one built to do a single job, each one chosen on purpose. A heavy receiver on the bottom, the brain of the whole thing. A turntable on top, lid raised, a record already turning. A cassette deck beside it, reels spinning behind a little lit window, and two speakers the size of nightstands angled into the room. People did not shove this into a corner. They built the room around it. There was a chair, the chair, placed exactly between the speakers, in the spot audiophiles called the sweet spot, the one point in the room where the sound from both sides arrived at the same instant. You sat in it, and you listened. Not in the background, not while doing three other things. Listening was the thing you were doing. It started with the ritual. You slid the record out of its sleeve, and that sleeve was art you actually held, 12 inches of it, with liner notes you read while the music played. You set the needle down by hand. There was a soft crackle, then the room filled up. You could watch the music move, the needles on the meters jumping with every drum hit. The machines ran warm. They had weight. They felt like they would outlive you because they were built to. None of this happened by accident, and it started with a violinist. Avery Fisher was a book designer in New York who loved classical music so much that he wanted a radio that sounded like a live orchestra standing in his room. In 1945, he founded Fisher Radio, and he did something that quietly rewired the entire industry. Before Fisher, a home stereo was one sealed box, radio, amplifier, speaker, all welded into a single unit. Fisher pulled them apart. He sold the pieces separately, each one engineered to be the best in the world at its one job: Before Fisher, a stereo was an appliance. After Fisher, it was a stack. His machines earned a nickname, the Rolls-Royce of sound. Heads of state bought them. Famous musicians bought them. One of his early tuners now sits in the Smithsonian, labeled as the nation's first high-fidelity receiver. For a while, the finest audio on earth was built in New York City. Then the competition crossed the Pacific, and the gentle world of high fidelity turned into an arms race. By the 1970s, the Japanese manufacturers had taken over the living room, and they had figured out something about the American buyer. He wanted power, so they gave him power. Pioneer, Marantz, Sansui, Technics. They stopped competing on taste and started competing on watts, and the trade press called it exactly what it was, the receiver wars. Every year the numbers climbed, 200 watts a channel, 270 watts, 300 watts. Technics built one rated at 330 watts. These were not subtle machines. The Pioneer SX, 1980, the king of them all, put out 270 watts a channel, weighed 78 pounds, and when a reviewer for Audio magazine put it on the bench in 1978, he found it could punch out nearly 460 watts in short bursts. Inside it was a transformer the size of a coffee can, and heat sinks like a car radiator. Pioneer did not advertise it in some electronics pamphlet. They ran a full-page ad in Playboy. By the late 1970s, the stereo had become a symbol of who you were. And it was not only the loud machines. A small Japanese company founded in 1948, named Nakamichi, built a cassette deck called the Nakamichi 1000. It was the first in the world with 3 separate heads, and it took a cheap plastic format meant for dictation and turned it into something that could rival a studio master tape. Their masterpiece, the Dragon, is still worshipped by collectors today. This was the peak, the absolute high watermark of sound you could hold in your hands and own outright. And here's the part that should stay with you. Every machine I just named still works. Restored, they sell for thousands. They were built to last 50 years, and they have. So if the gear was this good, this beautiful, this permanent, then what on earth happened to it? The answer shows up in 1982, wearing the disguise of an upgrade. It arrived as a small silver disc. The compact disc, launched by Sony and Philips, promised perfect sound. No hiss, no scratches, no getting up to flip the record. It was convenient. And convenience, it turns out, is how every one of these systems quietly dies. The CD did not need the ritual. You did not sit in the sweet spot for a CD. You pressed a button and walked away. Then, in 2001, Apple put 1,000 songs in your pocket with the iPod, and 2 years later, opened the iTunes store, where a single song cost 99 cents and arrived as a thing called an MP3, a file deliberately shrunk, stripped of the parts of the sound that engineers decided you would never miss. Smaller, lighter, good enough. Each step traded a little more fidelity and a little more ownership for a little more convenience. But notice this, you still bought the song. You still owned the file. It lived on your machine. The thing that finished the job, the thing that took ownership off the table completely, was not a machine at all. It was a business model. And it came from Sweden. Spotify launched in the United States in July of 2011, and it offered something that sounded like a miracle. Every song ever recorded, all of it, for about $10 a month. You would be a fool to buy records again, and almost nobody did. But read the deal the way your grandfather would have read it. You were not buying anything, you were renting access. The instant you stopped paying, and it is $11.99 a month now, forever. All of it vanishes. The music you have is not yours. It never was. And that, quietly, was the entire point. A customer who buys an album once is worth that album once. A customer who rents access for the rest of his life is worth a payment every single month until the day he dies. The industry did not bury the record because the record sounded bad. It buried it because owning was less profitable than renting. Two facts, side by side, and you can connect them yourself. So look at what's left. The specialty hi-fi shop, the place with a wall of glowing receivers where a salesman taught you what you were actually hearing. Gone from almost every town in America. The stack has been replaced by a phone and two plastic earbuds streaming compressed audio over Bluetooth, a signal squeezed small enough to fly through the air. And the great names, the ones that meant something? Fisher, the Rolls-Royce of sound, was sold to Emerson for $31 million, handed off to Sanyo, and quietly discontinued in 2012. Nakamichi, which built the finest cassette decks the world has ever seen, went bankrupt in 2002 and is now owned by a holding company in Hong Kong that prints the Nakamichi name on plastic soundbars. The names survived. The companies that earned them did not. And here is the detail that says everything. Avery Fisher gave so much money to Lincoln Center that they put his name on the concert hall, the home of the New York Philharmonic. Avery Fisher Hall. In 2015, they took his name off the building and sold it to a record label billionaire named David Geffen for $100 million. The man who spent his life making recorded music sound real had his name erased from the hall, and the industry that replaced him bought the wall. So the question we started with, why did the most beautiful machine in the house disappear? It did not lose. It was traded. We traded a thing we owned for a thing we rent. And here is where I will be honest with you, because the truth is more interesting than the easy version. Mostly, we got a good deal. 100 million songs in your pocket for the price of 2 albums a year is not a scam. It is, by almost any measure, an extraordinary deal. But access is not ownership. And somewhere along the way, we quietly forgot that those were two different things. There is one piece of evidence that proves we still know the difference. Deep down. Vinyl. The record, the format that was supposed to be dead and buried decades ago, has now grown for 19 years straight. In 2024, Americans bought more records than CDs, 44 million of them, the most since the 1980s. People are lining up to pay again for the one thing a subscription can never sell them, something they get to keep. And the machines themselves? That Pioneer SX 1980 your grandfather paid a month's salary for in 1978. A clean one today sells for as much as $12,000. It is worth more now than the day he carried it home. The object outlived the industry that built it. It outlived the stores that sold it. It outlived the very idea that sound was something a person owned. Your grandfather's stereo cost him a month of his life's wages. And decades later, it was still his, warm and humming in the corner, waiting for him to sit down in the chair and listen. Your subscription ends the second you stop paying. He bought sound once. We rent it forever. The machine didn't get worse. The deal did. If this is the kind of story you want more of, about the systems that disappeared while nobody was watching, subscribe and stick around. There is a lot they never told you.